Okay, so today we're tackling a bit of a sensitive subject. We're doing a deep dive on this podcast episode called 10 Signs Your Woman is Cheating with Your Best Friend.
Mm-hmm.
It's, infidelity. It's never an easy thing to talk about.
Yeah,
But we're going to break it down, analyze it,
absolutely.
and hopefully give you some practical insights along the way.
Yeah, and I think, it's important to acknowledge that, this is something that many people worry about, right? The idea of infidelity is scary enough, but when it involves someone you consider a close friend,
Yeah,
that adds a whole other layer of complexity and anxiety.
absolutely.
Our goal here today isn't to diagnose anyone's situation or tell you what to do. It's really to look at these so-called signs that the podcast lays out and explore what they might tell us or what they might not tell us about the dynamics of relationships, and
Right.
to encourage you to think critically about the information you're consuming.
Right. And to think about your own relationships and how this might apply to your own life. Okay, so this podcast that we're deep diving into lists out 10 red flags, and the first one that caught my eye was sudden distance in communication.
Uh-huh.
Talks about, your partner becoming emotionally withdrawn, maybe not texting as much, not sharing as much about their day. What are your thoughts on that? Have you seen that kind of shift in your work?
Yeah, it's interesting. Communication patterns in relationships, they do change over time.
Right.
But change doesn't always equal bad, right? Like, imagine a couple who used to, I don't know, text constantly all day long, and then one of them starts a really demanding new job.
Right.
They might just need a little bit more space in the evenings to decompress, to recharge. That doesn't automatically mean that there's a problem in the relationship.
Yeah. That
It's
part.
really about looking at the context,
So I guess, how do you tell the difference then between a healthy adjustment versus something that might be more worrisome?
Well, I think one of the keys is looking for patterns, not just like isolated incidents. Right. Is this a temporary change, or is this like a consistent trend that's causing you concern? Does it come along with other shifts in the relationship, like defensiveness or avoidance?
Right, right. And it makes me think about the podcast also mentioned secretive behavior, like hiding phone screens or changing passwords. They made a point of saying that there's a difference between healthy privacy and worrisome secrecy.
Yeah.
But I feel like that line can be really blurry sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what it really comes down to is what's considered normal within your relationship. Healthy boundaries around privacy, they're unique to every single couple. So, think about it this way. If your partner has always been very private about their phone, right? Like
Right.
from the very beginning, then a sudden password change might not be a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But if they've always been open and then suddenly, boom, everything's locked down,
Yeah.
that could be a red flag.
Right.
It's all relative to what your established dynamic is.
That's a great way to look at it.
It
It's
is.
not necessarily like a single action.
Right.
It's about deviations from what you guys have always done.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the source's point about unexplained time together. Specifically, your partner and your friend
Okay.
hanging out more without you.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, this is where things can get really tricky, and it's super important to, not jump to conclusions. Let's say your partner and your best friend have discovered some shared interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they both love, I don't know, pottery or something.
Okay.
Or maybe your friend is going through a hard time and your partner is being supportive.
Right.
Those are totally valid reasons for them to be spending more time together.
Yeah.
I think the key here is to think about the history of their friendship.
Okay, so if they've always been close, it might not be cause for alarm.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
It's about looking for a significant deviation from the norm. Right. Like if your partner and your friend have always just been kind of casual acquaintances and suddenly they're like best friends and hanging out all the time.
Right. Yeah.
That's when you're like, okay, maybe something's shifted here.
That's much more noticeable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a good opportunity to like have an open conversation with your partner about, hey, I've noticed this. What's going on? Just kind of check in.
Right. Right. It's about understanding the nuances of their relationship, not just like
Yeah,
the fact that they're spending time together.
exactly.
Another thing that the podcast mentioned was overly friendly or awkward interactions between your partner and your friend.
Yeah.
Like, maybe they're overcompensating because they actually do have this tension from this hidden affair.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's true that body language and tone of voice can definitely reveal underlying emotions, right? We've all had that experience where we're like, something just feels off here. But the thing about nonverbal communication is that it can be so hard to interpret accurately.
Right.
It's like trying to read a book in a language you don't understand.
Yeah.
You're going to miss a lot of the nuances.
Right. So how do we make sense of those mixed signals then?
Well, I think it comes back to considering all the possible explanations, right?
Mm.
Maybe they're acting awkward because they know that you're suspicious and they're feeling self-conscious.
Right.
Or maybe they're just not good at hiding their discomfort in social situations.
Yeah.
Some people are just naturally more awkward than others.
Mm.
So while a sudden change in their interaction style might be noteworthy, it's really important not to jump to conclusions based solely on that.
So it's like that classic advice, don't read into every little thing.
Exactly. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Right. Now, the podcast also talked about defensiveness as a potential indicator of guilt.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if your partner gets really defensive whenever you bring up your friend, they suggest that could be a way of deflecting.
Yeah, I've seen this pattern countless times in my work. And defensiveness is rarely about just one single issue, right? It's often a deeply ingrained communication style that's rooted in, insecurity, fear, past experiences.
Yeah.
Someone who's quick to get defensive might have a whole history of feeling misunderstood or unfairly judged. And that doesn't automatically equate to guilt.
So instead of assuming the worst, it's more productive to try to understand the underlying reasons for their defensiveness.
Absolutely, yeah. Think of it like this. You're trying to unlock a door, but instead of picking the lock, you're throwing a battering ram at it.
Wow, okay.
Right? You're probably going to cause a lot of damage and not actually get through the door. Addressing the communication breakdown itself will be much more effective than just assuming that their defensiveness equals guilt.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you.
It's about understanding the why behind the behavior, not just the behavior itself.
Yes, exactly.
And it leads perfectly into the source's next point, which was a sudden interest in your friend's life.
Oh, okay.
They suggest that, if your partner's suddenly overly invested in their hobbies or problems, it could be suspicious. What do you think about that?
This one is tricky, because people's interests do evolve over time in relationships.
Right.
So imagine, for example, your partner has never really cared about football.
Okay.
But then your friend is a huge football fan. They start watching games together. And suddenly your partner's like really into football. On its own, that might not mean a whole lot.
Yeah.
But if it's combined with other changes like, increased secrecy or unexplained absences, then it becomes another piece of the puzzle.
So it's all about patterns and context, right? Like, is this genuine interest or does it feel forced or out of character for your partner?
Exactly.
Okay.
You're looking for a significant deviation from their usual behavior.
Right.
And that's a good principle to apply to a lot of these signs, really.
Speaking of deviations, the podcast also highlighted inside jokes and private conversations as a potential sign of a deeper connection that excludes you.
Yeah.
I can see how that would feel hurtful and isolating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's natural to feel a little left out when you're not in on the joke.
Right.
But shared experiences do naturally create bonds between people, right? Think about your own close friends.
Yeah.
You probably have inside jokes and memories that are just yours.
Absolutely.
So I think the key here is distinguishing between healthy bonding and intentional exclusion.
Okay.
Right. Do you consistently feel left out?
Right.
Or are these just like moments of shared humor between friends?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's about looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
The overall dynamic, not just isolating a few instances.
Right.
And I think this leads perfectly into the next sign, which is changes in appearance.
Oh.
The podcast used the example of your partner, dressing up more, putting more effort in when they know they're going to be around your friend.
Interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, the psychology of attraction, right? It's a fascinating thing.
Yeah.
We're naturally drawn to people who make us feel good about ourselves,
Yeah.
So if your partner is suddenly putting extra effort into their appearance,
Yeah.
I think it's worth asking yourself, do these changes align with their usual style?
Right.
Are they generally someone who's image conscious? Or is this a sudden noticeable shift?
Right. Like you said before, context is everything.
Exactly.
It's about looking at the bigger picture, not just isolating one behavior. And then the podcast moved on to the topic of avoiding alone time. Especially, if your partner seems to have no problem spending time with your friend, but they're avoiding alone time with you.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, this brings up the important topic of intimacy. And, decreased intimacy can definitely be a red flag in any relationship.
Yeah.
But it's rarely about one specific person, right?
Okay.
Like stress, life changes, individual needs. All these factors can affect intimacy levels. So maybe your partner is going through a period of low energy or they're feeling totally overwhelmed with work.
Right.
Those things can impact their desire for intimacy with anyone, not just you.
So it's not necessarily a sign that they're pushing you away in favor of someone else.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is why open communication is so crucial. If you're feeling a lack of intimacy,
Yeah.
talk to your partner about it. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't make accusations.
Right.
But just express your needs and concerns honestly and see if you can work together to find some solutions.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like bottling things up is just going to make the situation worse.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. The final sign that the podcast focused on was inconsistent stories or lies.
Mm-hmm.
They really emphasized that even small lies can indicate that something bigger is being hidden.
Yeah. Honesty is the bedrock of any healthy relationship. So if you're noticing inconsistencies or you're catching your partner in lies, no matter how small,
Yeah.
it's important to address them directly, but do it calmly.
Okay.
Remember, accusations are just going to lead to defensiveness. So instead, try expressing your concerns in a non-confrontational way. For example, you could say something like, "Hey, I'm a little confused about what you said earlier. Can you help me understand?"
Right.
That opens up the conversation without putting them on the defensive.
It's a good approach.
Yeah.
So we've covered all 10 signs that were presented in this podcast.
We did, yeah.
What's the overall takeaway for our listeners? What do you think?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that these are potential indicators, right?
Okay.
Not definitive proof of infidelity. Think of them as like starting points for observation and reflection, not a checklist for accusation.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
Check.
Right, exactly.
You must be cheating.
Yeah. And it's interesting. The recurring theme throughout all of this has been context, communication, critical thinking.
Absolutely.
Those are so important.
And trust your gut, but don't jump to conclusions.
Exactly. If you're genuinely concerned, open and honest communication with your partner is essential. And, if you find those conversations are getting really difficult
Yeah.
or unproductive, seeking professional guidance from a therapist or a counselor can be really invaluable.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Sometimes an outside perspective is just what you need to navigate those tough conversations. One thing that struck me about this podcast is it focuses solely on the woman's behavior.
Yeah.
It doesn't really address, the role of the friend or the dynamic between all three people involved.
Yeah, that's a valid observation.
What do you think about that?
Well, infidelity is rarely, if ever, a one-sided issue.
Right.
So it's important to examine, the actions and motivations of everyone involved, including the friend who's supposedly, the other person in this scenario.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's definitely worth considering all sides of the equation.
So are there any signs or behaviors specific to the friend that we should be looking out for?
Well, it's not about assigning blame,
Right.
but I think it's worthwhile to observe any shifts in the friend's behavior as well.
Okay.
Are they suddenly more secretive or withdrawn when you're around? Do they seem to be like encouraging distance between you and your partner? Have they started making comments that, seem to undermine your relationship?
Those are really insightful points.
Yeah.
It's easy to get so caught up in your partner's actions that you kind of overlook
Mm-hmm.
the role of the other person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that this podcast episode is just one perspective, right?
Right.
It's aimed at a specific audience, and it doesn't necessarily encompass the complexities of every single situation.
Right. And all of these signs, they're not exclusive to infidelity.
Yeah.
They could be indicators of other underlying issues in the relationship,
Exactly.
regardless of whether the friend is involved or not.
Absolutely. Jealousy, insecurity, communication breakdowns, changes in individual needs and desires.
Right.
All of those things can manifest in very similar ways.
So how can our listener differentiate between, general relationship issues versus something more serious like infidelity?
That's where self-reflection and open communication come in, right?
Okay.
It's crucial to examine your own anxieties, your own insecurities. Are you projecting past experiences onto the current situation? Are there unresolved issues in your relationship that are fueling your suspicions?
So before jumping to conclusions about infidelity, it's important to step back and say, okay, Are there underlying problems here that need to be addressed anyway?
Exactly. Sometimes these signs are actually a wake-up call,
Yeah.
right? They're prompting you to take a closer look at the health and stability of your relationship as a whole.
That's a really valuable insight. It shifts the focus from blame and accusation to like a more constructive approach
Yeah,
of self-awareness and communication.
exactly.
Yeah, that's really great. This has been such an insightful discussion. We've really dissected these 10 signs,
We have.
challenged some assumptions, and I think explored the complexities of relationships in a much deeper way than I even expected.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Knowledge is power.
Hmm.
And the more we understand about ourselves, our relationships, the intricacies of human behavior,
Yeah,
the better equipped we are to create healthy and fulfilling connections.
absolutely. And if any of this resonates with you, prioritize open communication,
Mm.
self-reflection. Those are powerful tools for navigating any relationship challenge.
And don't hesitate to seek professional support if you need it. A
Yeah,
therapist can be a great resource.
absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure.
I think our listeners have a lot to think about after this deep dive.
I hope so. And I just want to say, even though infidelity can be incredibly painful, it doesn't have to define a relationship or a person's worth. With the right approach, it can actually be a catalyst for growth,
Okay,
healing, and a deeper understanding of oneself and one's needs.
that's a really powerful message to end on.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the complexities of life and relationships. That's an interesting thought. What do you mean by exploring the underlying causes?
Well, instead of just focusing on the behaviors we've been talking about,
Okay.
what if we kind of dug deeper and asked, why?
Mhm.
Why might someone be drawn to infidelity in the first place?
Mm.
What emotional needs might be unmet in their current relationship?
Okay.
What vulnerabilities or insecurities could be at play?
I see what you mean. So it's kind of shifting the perspective from judgment
Yeah.
to trying to understand.
Exactly. It's about encouraging empathy, even in the face of actions that can be, really hurtful.
Right, right. Because, ultimately, infidelity is a complex issue.
Oh, for sure.
It's often a symptom of these deeper issues
Mm-hmm.
that haven't been addressed.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not always so simple.
So instead of just asking, is my partner cheating?
Yeah.
We should also be asking, okay, what's going on beneath the surface here in our relationship?
Exactly. Yeah. It's about recognizing that infidelity is rarely, black and white.
Right.
There are a lot of shades of gray. And understanding those nuances can be really crucial for both healing and prevention.
Wow. This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
Yeah.
We've really dissected these 10 signs.
We have.
We've challenged some assumptions.
Yeah.
And I think we've explored this whole idea of relationships in a much deeper way than I even anticipated.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
Likewise.
Yeah.
I think our listeners had a lot to think about
I hope so.
after this deep dive. Do you have any final words of wisdom
Ooh, words of wisdom.
for our listeners before we wrap things up?
Well, I just want to reiterate that, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more we understand about ourselves, our relationships, this whole messy, beautiful tapestry of human behavior,
Mm-hmm.
the better equipped we are to create those healthy and fulfilling connections that we all crave.
Absolutely. And if any of this resonated with you today, remember, open communication,
Yes.
self-reflection,
Mm-hmm.
those are powerful tools no matter what relationship challenge you're facing.
And don't hesitate to reach out for professional support if
Yeah.
you need a little extra guidance along the way. Therapists are amazing.
Yeah, they can be a great resource.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today and for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
I think our listeners got a lot out of it.
I hope so.
And I just want to, end by saying, even though infidelity can be incredibly painful,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to define your relationship or a person's worth. And with the right approach, it can actually be an opportunity
Yeah.
for growth, for healing, for deeper understanding.
I love that. Beautifully said.
Thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.